Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Al and Sage and Alyssa. I love the Project Por Amor. I think it's so important to maintain these bridges to and from Cuba during this time. And really, I'm grateful for the work that you're doing and glad to add a little something to it as well. So thank you to everybody who's joining us tonight. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you. I'm going to use a slideshow to tell you the stories I want to tell tonight. And so just bear with me. I'm going to put that on and hopefully it's all working fine. So here we go. I've got a lot of images and stories to share with you, and just follow along on these literary and Jewish journeys to Cuba. So this is a rundown of everything we're going to cover in the next 40 minutes. I can talk very fast. I've been teaching for a long time, so I can speed up if we need to, if we're running out of time. But we'll be looking at Jewish migration to Cuba in the 20s and 30s, my own family's journey to Cuba, the Jewish community in Cuba on the eve of the revolution, the Jewish Cuban departure to Miami, my own immigrant childhood in New York, my return journeys and search for bridges to Cuba, the evolving Jewish community in Cuba, and then we'll turn in the last part to poetic and fictional visions of Jewish Cuba and my collaborations, literary and artistic, with Rolando Estevez, an amazing artist and bookmaker who lives in Matanzas. So let's get started with the Jewish journeys. We're going to start there first. So you're wondering, why did Jews go to Cuba? People always ask me that. Why did they go to Cuba? Well, there's a very good reason. The majority really wanted to come to the United States, but you probably know that there was a very large Jewish migration to the United States at the end of the 19th century. And as you can see in this anti-Semitic cartoon, there was a sense that maybe there were too many of these Jewish immigrants coming to the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century. So what happens? This Immigration Act gets passed in 1924 to limit the immigration of aliens into the United States. And they don't specifically say Jewish people, but they limit the entrance of people from Eastern and Southern Europe. And just to give you an idea, here you can see the quotas. They created a quota system, and the majority of immigrants that they wanted were Western European, non-Jewish immigrants. And you can see that the number from Poland was just 3% of that total. And then from Turkey, even less. You can just see how few numbers of people from those countries they were allowing into the United States after 1924. So that has a big impact on Jews who are trying to immigrate in the period between World War I and World War II, as conditions are growing worse and worse for the Jews in Europe. Now, it's important to know that before the migration of Jews from Europe in the 1920s, there was already a small Jewish community in Cuba made up of American Jews, and they founded the first Jewish cemetery in Cuba, which is on the outskirts of Havana in Guanabacoa. So in the early part of the 20th century, there were American Jewish expatriates living in Cuba. They formed a Reform synagogue, and they founded the first Jewish cemetery in Cuba. And this is very important because of the Jewish tradition of being buried on Jewish soil at death. And so therefore, having a cemetery in a sense is almost more important as the first thing you're going to build than having a synagogue. And so the American Jews had businesses in Cuba. They also had plantations and other kinds of businesses. And this very famous restaurant, the Moishe Pipik restaurant, was an American Jewish kosher restaurant that existed in Havana. But I'm going to focus on those Jews that immigrated to Cuba in the 20s and 30s, largely after that Immigration Act was passed. And they mostly came from Eastern Europe, from Poland and Russia and other countries, Hungary and many other countries, and then from Turkey to Cuba. Now, I'm going to tell you about my family. Now, my father's family was from Turkey. They were Sephardic Jews, which means they were originally from Spain 500 years ago. They were among the Jews who were expelled at the time of the Inquisition in 1492. And they ended up eventually in Turkey. And that's where my father's parents were born. They met in Cuba, but they were from the same town. They were from the town of Silivri, which is very, very close to Istanbul. And many, many of the Sephardic Jews in Cuba came from this town, interestingly enough. And they were very active in the Haim synagogue. This was the first synagogue founded in Cuba in 1914. So the Sephardic Jews founded this synagogue. And curiously enough, this synagogue was located on, just guess which street would have a synagogue for Sephardic Jews, Calle del Inquisidor, the street of the Inquisitor. That's where Shevet Haim was located. And that was on my father's side. On my mother's side, my mother's parents were from Poland and Russia. And they also arrived in the 20s. My grandfather, my Russian grandfather, worked on the railroad. He was very, very proud of this. He would always show us this railway ID card that he had. And this is a picture of his brother, but he, like many other of these Jewish immigrants, worked as street peddlers. They peddled all over Havana, all over Cuba. They were iconic figures in Cuba, these peddlers, right? And there were so many Jews from Poland in Cuba that the common term for a Jewish person became Polaco. They would say Polaco and they meant a Jewish person because there were so many of them. They fanned out all over the island selling fabric and cloth and blankets and all kinds of things to people in the countryside. My grandmother, this is my maternal grandmother, Esther. She has a fabulous story. She was the first of 7 siblings to go to Cuba. Her father was already in Cuba, and he made enough money after 3 years of work to bring one of his children to Cuba, and he wanted to bring one of his sons. But my grandmother, Esther, was the oldest of the 7 children, and she begged her father to let her be the first, and she promised him that she would help him get the rest of the family to safety. She was from this town of Govorovo, about an hour away from Warsaw. And here to show you the postcard that you just saw with her picture, she wrote this, she inscribed this postcard to her father as an eternal memento as she was about to get married to my grandfather. And just as I said, she worked really hard. She was a young woman. She went to Cuba by herself and she helped bring the family, her siblings, her mother, to Cuba right on the eve of the war. The man with the hat was my great-grandfather, and that was her father. And they settled in Agramonte. This is very interesting. When the family was reunited, they went to a small rural town in Matanzas. This is what it looked like back in that era. And that was where they settled. And together they ran a general store. They were the only Jewish family in this town. This is what the town looks like today. And I was always so fascinated by these stories of Agramonte, imagining this Polish Jewish family settling in the countryside. This was a sugar growing region that has very, very strong Afro-Cuban rituals. They have a yearly bembe for San Lázaro, for Baba Luaye that I attended 2 years ago. And so to think of this Jewish family, this is where they end up in Cuba. It's so fascinating. And my grandmother's story is so fascinating that is the subject of my new novel, Letters from Cuba, which will be out on August 25th. And so here's my family. Here's my grandparents, my aunt, my mother, and my uncle. And this is already by the early to mid 50s. And you get a sense from this picture of how, as Jewish people, they had prospered by this time in Cuba by the 50s. And here you see my parents getting married, the 2 sides of the family. And at that time, in 1956, when they married, it was very unusual to have a marriage of an Ashkenazi person with a Sephardic person, because these were two very different Jewish cultures. The Yiddish culture of my mother's family was very different from the Sephardic Ladino-speaking culture of my father's family. And so the 2 of them coming together at that time was considered almost an intermarriage, though of course they were aware that they were all Jewish, but very differently Jewish. And so by this time, this is mid-1950s, by this time, this Jewish community that my family formed part of, by then there are 15 to 20,000 Jews in Cuba, the majority in Havana, but also spread out all over Cuba with synagogues in Santa Clara and Camagüey, in Santiago de Cuba. But the heart of the community, the major part of the community was in Havana. And by the 50s, they're so prosperous, they're so sure of themselves that they're going to stay in Cuba forever, that they build this major Jewish community center that we know as the Patronato, right? The Casa de la Comunidad de Brea de Cuba. It's a huge building. Those of you that have been to Cuba will be familiar with it. The front part of it that you're seeing here, after the revolution, with what was left of the Jewish community, they had to give most of it away to the state, and that became the Brecht Theater. But in the 50s, they were looking to stay in Cuba. They had become quite prosperous. They had Jewish schools, they had Jewish theater, restaurants. They were doing extremely well, and they built this big Jewish community center. And the architect is Aquiles Capablanca, who was a major Cuban architect. And so you have this sense that this is a community that has really come to find its place and its sense of home in Cuba. And here you can see the famous arch of this synagogue that any of you that have been to Havana will have certainly visited. Now, the curious thing is we lived half a block away from the synagogue. We often passed by, and I was often photographed in front of the temple. And here I am not too far away from where we lived as well, this beautiful park on 21st Street, Calle 21 and Esquina E. And there I am in one of the lovely dresses that were made for me back in Cuba with my own handbag and everything. And this is interesting. This is one of the last pictures taken of me in Cuba, because I briefly went to Jewish day school in Havana, where instruction was given in Spanish and Yiddish. Now look at that little uniform. I was like 4.5 years old, and fortunately, I share a prop with you. My mother kept the uniform and brought it with us when we came to the United States. I don't know if you can see the hem. It was hemmed up, and the idea was that I would wear it for a long time. Look at that big hem that I had on my uniforms. So I was briefly part of this community as a little girl. And had we stayed in Cuba, I might have learned this poem. This is a poem about Jose Marti, the great independence leader, written in Yiddish and translated into Spanish. And you can see some of the words here. Well, here in Spanish, here in English: blessed land, singing amid sugarcane and tobacco to its rising paradise. So the sense that they had found, that the Jewish community had found a paradise in Cuba. Now, everything changes, as we know, with the coming of Fidel Castro to power in 1959. And the Jewish community as a whole is very much in favor of the revolution at first. Among the first changes implemented by the revolution was rents were reduced by half. And my parents were a young family with me, and then my brother was born with 2 young children. They were struggling to make it, and they were very happy that the rent on their apartment was reduced by half. And my mother, the story she tells is that she went out and bought this lamp that you see in the picture. So they were still feeling part of the revolution. But by 1961, things changed for the Jewish community. This is when Fidel Castro declares that the revolution is going to be socialist, and properties are nationalized. Most of the Jews were small shop owners, or some of them were large merchants as well. And their properties, their businesses were nationalized between 60 and 61. And that was when the majority chose to leave. They were also very concerned that as a public school system was being created in Cuba, that they would not be able to maintain their Jewish day schools, and as atheism was being enforced on the population, that they would not be able to maintain their traditions. And so those were the reasons that they left. They weren't leaving because of anti-Semitism. They were leaving because of the social and economic changes that were taking place in Cuba. And in this picture, you see my grandmother leaving Cuba. She's carrying that box. And so it's very interesting. The community largely resettles in Miami with most of the Cuban community, and they recreate their identities in Cuba. They create a Cuban Hebrew congregation in Miami Beach in memory of the Patronato that I talked about earlier. So in memory of their lives in Cuba. This woman, Ofelia, has been a major force in the Cuban Hebrew congregation. You see her 2 flags there, the American and the Cuban, and how they tried to maintain the memory, the nostalgia, the culture of Cuba. This was a shoe store owned by one of the Cuban Jews, and it says "Se habla Yiddish," which is a wonderful way of meshing the Spanish with the Yiddish. And then the Sephardic Cuban community, they built their own temple, Temple Moses, which still exists as well, just as the Cuban Hebrew still exists in Miami Beach. And interestingly, here also you see this memory of the temple that they had in Cuba, this Cuban Sephardic Hebrew congregation, and that they have come forced into exile during the early 60s, right? And so they're recreating their identity in Miami. The women continue to make borrecas, or boreks as they're known in Turkish, a very traditional food among the community. And the men continued and continue to play dominoes. And so much that in the cemetery in Miami, where many of the Jewish Cubans are buried, I found this tombstone dedicated to a grandfather, a papi, a father, who was the king of dominoes, and the tombstone was decorated with domino pieces, right? So this is how much they carried the culture into their new lives in Miami. Now, our story was a little different because we resettled in New York. Many of the Cuban Jews went to New York first and then eventually went on to Miami. But our family, my parents in particular, decided to stay in New York. Here I am with my parents and my brother, and getting used to a new life in New York, to the snow and the snowstorms that exist. And we arrived at the time of the World's Fair in New York. And I remember having this sense as a kid that, that we were part of this big thing of world cultures in some way, that we were Cubans, yes, and we had this very particular identity, but there were many other immigrants around us. We weren't the only ones. But we were struggling as immigrants at first. This is the first apartment that we lived in Queens, New York. It was a one-bedroom apartment behind my mother. You see that sofa, that was the sofa bed that she and my father slept on every night. Behind was the one bedroom and that I shared with my brother. And notice another important lamp in this picture. This one is covered in plastic because every possession we had was so valuable that the lamp had to be maintained with its plastic covering to be able to take care of it. And I had a very unique experience in that soon after arriving from Cuba, we were in a terrible car accident in New York on the Belt Parkway. And I ended up with a very severe injury to my right leg. And as a result, I had to be in a body cast for a year. So my immigrant childhood got meshed together with this experience of having to be an invalid for a year and having to have my mother take care of me. And I think that may have inspired me perhaps to want to be a writer and a thinker and a traveler, being immobile for a year, listening to a lot of the stories about Cuba. And I wrote this novel, Lucky Broken Girl, that came out 3 years ago, that's about the story of both being a Cuban immigrant child and being a wounded child for a year until I was able to get up and move around again and walk and see the world. So I was always very curious about Cuba. I was the first person in my family to go back to Cuba, to see Cuba with my own eyes and experience it. And initially when I first went in 1979 when I was a student during the brief opening in relations during the Jimmy Carter period. And then I started traveling on a regular basis in the early 90s. And initially I was just trying to stand in the same places where I had stood as a child, as if I could almost reclaim those places by re-inhabiting those spaces. It was a very spiritual journey at first that led me back to Cuba. And one of the first people that I reconnected with was this woman, Caridad Martinez, or Caro, as she was known, who was my nanny, who took care of me and my brother when we were little kids. And it was really amazing to discover that she had kept all these pictures of my family. So my Jewish family was somehow being held on to in Cuba by this woman that knew Caro, who knew my entire family, my entire extended family. She's holding up a picture of my cousin here, and then she had these pictures of my great grandparents. So it was just so incredible to discover that, and I became very anchored by her and felt that she was my anchor in Cuba, my second mother in Cuba, and that gave me a certain amount of energy to go back and a sense of safety in going back to Cuba. And so I was going in the 90s. This was the period of the Balcero Crisis in 1994, were, you know, I and a lot of other people, Cuban Americans and others, were going to Cuba, but at the same time, so many Cubans were trying to leave. So we were going and they were leaving. And it was as if the whole island had become a raft. This is a piece by the artist Sandra Ramos. And Cubans were trying to find different, sometimes very, very ingenious ways to leave the island, as with this truck boat that was supposed to go across water and then just keep driving when they got to Florida. And I was so inspired by all of these experiences that I created an anthology called Bridges to Cuba, Puentes a Cuba. It was one of the first efforts to bring together the voices of Cubans on the island and the voices of Cubans outside the island in 1994-95 when I produced this. And during this time, I was, of course, beginning to observe the Jewish community. There was no way I could be in Cuba and not see what was going on with the Jewish community. But at first, I was just kind of hanging out with them. I wasn't trying to study them as an anthropologist, but there were many people just like discovering the Jewish community in this period and realizing, as it is said in this article, that we could have been them and they could have been us, this tremendous sense of connection to the Jews that were left in Cuba. And it's important to know that in the 90s is when the Jewish community begins to revitalize. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was only very few elders who had maintained Jewish ritual on the island. Most people were involved in the revolution in various kinds of ways and weren't religiously involved. But after 1991, the Cuban government changed the constitution, and you could be a member of the Communist Party and have a religious affiliation. So many people of all faiths, Catholic, Christian, Jewish, Afro-Cuban faiths as well, people started coming back openly to religion. And there was a lot of curiosity about Fidel and the Jews because people discovered, especially American Jews, when they went to Cuba, that the Jews were well treated. They hadn't suffered anti-Semitism. There's a kosher butcher shop in Havana, and there was a lot of curiosity about, you know, why was this the case in Cuba, and whether perhaps even Fidel Castro had some Sephardic Jewish ancestry. And so it was very curious for me because places that I associated with home, with family, with Jewish memory, our Jewish memory, became sites of pilgrimage. And so the Patronato synagogue that I talked about earlier became this important site of pilgrimage. And so many people have stopped in there to see this synagogue, you know, whether it's Steven Spielberg or Madonna, all kinds of people have come through. And here you can see the synagogue on the inside. And that's Adela Duarin, who is the president of the Jewish community of Cuba. And she has been a very important figure in maintaining the Jewish community. She has all the memories of the pre-revolutionary community, and then she's stayed in Cuba after the revolution. She's a lawyer by training, but her job during the years of the revolution was to take care of the library, because there's a library in this Patronato, in the Jewish Community Center, and she was the one that took care of the books, which I think is so important. And she's just an incredible person, totally fluent in English and Yiddish. And here you see her with this, you know, interesting background, the Jewish Star bookcase, and then a bust of Jose Marti below that. And so the cemetery as well that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk also became a pilgrimage site as more and more American Jews became interested in seeing this Jewish community, seeing what was left of it. And by this time, speaking about the community in the last 20 years or so, there have been approximately 1,000 Jews throughout this period, even as some have left, others have joined the community. And in the cemetery, you will find, among many other interesting tombstones, this one of Luis Lápidos, who was an amazing architect and person. And it has the two stars. It has the Jewish star and the communist star. And so the idea of how Jews were trying to, who stayed in Cuba, were trying to bring together these two cultures, bringing together the Jewish culture with the revolutionary culture, as in this picture of Che Guevara literally inside the synagogue. And I teamed up with the photographer Humberto Mayol, a Cuban photographer, to document the Jewish community. Who were the people who stayed in Cuba? What were their lives like? What were their experiences like? And what did they keep of the Jewish heritage? What artifacts did they hold on to? Like a kippah from a wedding in 1959, or a talit brought by a grandfather from Turkey. And I was so fascinated that people had held on to these things during this intense revolutionary period in Cuba. Even the wine cups and the Shabbat candle holders left by other Jews were there, and we could photograph them. An electricity bill that came in the name of a Jewish person who left 50 years ago, a mezuzah that had stayed behind. So all of these ways in which the Jewish presence was still there, even though the majority of the Jewish community that I talked about leaving to Miami and New York, that was 90% of the community left in the early 60s. But this 10% that stayed was there to hold on to these memories, to these artifacts, the ketubah, the Jewish marriage contract that was held on to by this woman, Sarah, and that she described for me as una carta de libertad, because this ketubah was used by her own children and a nephew and her brother to be able to leave Cuba, because in order to make aliyah to Israel, which Cuba allows, people have to prove that they're Jewish. They have to have documentation, and this became a document that many in the family used to leave Cuba. So it was kind of a sad document in a way, and that it led to this family separation. And here she's holding up these last pictures that were taken in the Patronato synagogue, the last quinceañera celebration. And she said, of all those women that turned 15 in 1959, I'm the only one that's still here in Cuba. So this sense of almost of shipwreck, of Jewish shipwreck. I traveled all over Cuba doing research on the Jews that still live on the island, and I met this amazing man, Haim Green, who lives in Palma Soriano, all the way on the eastern end of Cuba, and he had kept a lot of things, letters in Yiddish, photographs sent by family who ended up perishing in the war, and this picture of this postcard with the Hitler stamps that he had also held on to. So all of these incredible artifacts, memorabilia that people shared with me as a way of sharing their Jewish identity with me and the camera. And it's a community that by the early 2000s became a celebrity Jewish community as more and more people became interested in how is it possible that there's still Jews living in Cuba? How were they maintaining their Jewish traditions? And Steven Spielberg was among those celebrities that went and connected with the community, met this little boy at the time, a 5-year-old at the time, Moshe, who would say the prayers for the bread and the wine each week on Friday night at religious services. And the Jewish community was receiving and continues to receive aid from Jewish organizations in the United States and Canada and Latin America. Here's Moshe today with his father, David Prinstein, who is the vice president of the Jewish community. And curiously, when I was doing my research in the early 2000s and a little later, I learned that the Cuban government was creating a Jewish-themed hotel, the Hotel Raquel. This was also kind of a dream project of Eusebio Leal, who was key in the whole restoration of Old Havana. And so this was fascinating, a Jewish-themed hotel, because the government was aware that there was a lot of interest in the Jewish community. They decided to honor that interest and to create a Jewish-themed hotel where they served Jewish food, things like falafel and Hungarian goulash, whatever they could find out about online. And all of the rooms were named after Jewish biblical characters like Abraham and Sarah and so on. And of course, there is a Ruth room. And I took a group there shortly after the hotel opened, and they had reserved the Ruth room for me at the hotel, which led me to wonder, well, will I ever have a home in Cuba again, or just a hotel room with my name on it? And all of these reflections ended up in my book, An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba, which also was published in Spanish as Una Isla Llamada Hogar. And I continue to study the Jewish community and to keep up with the community and see how it's evolving and changing. And over the last few years, they've become more and more a part of the global Jewish community. They don't want to be seen as some exotic fringe community, but rather they're part of the global Jewish community. They may be a small community, but they're vibrant, and they want to connect with the global Jewish community. They have a Holocaust exhibit at the Centro Hebreo Sephardi, which is the Sephardic synagogue in Havana. There are 3 synagogues still functioning in Havana, and this exhibit is there. And on Yom HaShoah, we remember, they use the hashtag, we remember. And in this picture, you can see the teachers. Most of these people are teachers and other members of the community. Because they have a Sunday school and where they teach everybody from kids to adults Jewish history and culture and Hebrew language. And as I said, they receive aid from the Joint Distribution Committee, from B'nai B'rith and other Jewish organizations. And here is a member of the community holding gefilte fish, which is a traditional Jewish food that they receive as part of Passover donations. And you can see in this picture by how just a few years ago, there was still a lot of tourism around the Jewish community. And the Jewish community became a community that people wanted to visit and get to know. And this is at the Adath Israel, the Orthodox synagogue in Havana, and they have been making these kippah and other items, other artisanal Jewish items for sale to tourists and American Jews and others who come to visit the community. And it's been very interesting to me that the community has been holding these very large festivals, like a Hanukkah festival that I went to just a couple of years ago. You can see the huge Cuban flag here with the Israeli flag as well. And these are big holiday celebrations where they invite representatives of other Jewish communities, of Catholic and Christian and Afro-Cuban, Santeria and other religious communities in Havana to join in and to see how a holiday like Hanukkah is practiced. So they're very aware of things like outreach. They have a very important dance troupe that has traveled to different parts of Latin America. And the kids have participated in the Maccabean Games. And this young man that you see here in the front, he's a professional dancer, choreographer with the Tropicana Club, in fact, and he helps the kids, he teaches them dance, and this is one of the ways in which they represent themselves to the larger Cuban community and to the world. And I want to be sure that you know that in addition to Havana, there are small Jewish communities all over Cuba still, tiny communities of 20 or 30 people. These folks are in Santa Clara. That's David Tacher in the blue t-shirt, and he's an incredible person who fundraised to build a synagogue in Santa Clara because the original one had to be shut down because his grandfather, in fact, was the last Jewish person to use the synagogue back in the Revolutionary era. He had always felt so bad about that he really wanted a new synagogue in Santa Clara and fundraised with several American Jews and built this synagogue. And it has this fascinating symbol of the island with the menorah on top of it and the Jewish star behind. So this is very interesting. They may be few people, but they still are holding on to Jewishness, want to have Jewish communities and Jewish synagogues. And this is the community in Guantanamo. There's actually a very, very vibrant community there. The man in the red t-shirt, Rodolfo Mizrahi, is the president of that community as well. So you find these pockets of Jewish communities in Camagüey as well. In Cienfuegos, there are a couple of Jews as well. So you find pockets of small Jewish communities in the provinces as well. And I hope that this Jewish presence will continue in Cuba. I just want to show you these children, which gives us hope that there will be a Jewish community to continue on the island in the future. And in the faces of the girls, you can see the diversity of backgrounds and phenotypes, and it's a much more diverse community than it was in the pre-59 period. So now I'm going to move to literary journeys. I'll try to be really fast with this. So I had the good fortune in my early travels to Cuba in the early 1990s to have met Rolando Estevez, who is a great artist and book artist. And I was writing poems in English, and I met him at the Havana Book Fair, and we became friends. I was kind of like a sister to him because his family left Cuba in 1969. His sister was 8 years old, and he was not allowed to leave with her and their parents because he was 15. He was of military age, and so he stayed behind in Cuba. And at that time, when I was starting to travel to Cuba, he hadn't seen his sister in all those years. And I was kind of like the sister to him, this Cuban-American woman that was returning from Cuba to the island. And I was writing poems, and he said, "You've got to translate them into Spanish because I want to read your poems." And I started working really seriously on my poems. And he was working with Ediciones Vigía at that time. Here's Estevez and me. And they were making these beautiful handmade books with very simple materials and editions of 200. And that was how I got my poems published. My poems returned to Cuba. And this book, which was made with simple brown paper, as you can see, with mimeograph and so on, this book was the first book that Ediciones Vigía, this independent publishing press in Matanzas, published by a Cuban American author. I was their first one that they kind of took a chance on. And here you can see Ediciones Vigía in Matanzas, Cuba. And I went on to continue to write more poems. And fortunately, Estevez and the various people that worked in Vigía at that time were very supportive of my work. And I went on to publish this next book, Everything I Kept, Todo Lo Que Guardé, which, as you'll see, has a suitcase on the cover. And that suitcase opens up, and inside there's a Jewish star. Estevez is always very, very aware of my Jewish identity, and there's pictures of me. And the other lady is Dulce Maria Loinas, a Cuban poet who became a real source of inspiration for me for my own writing. And you see that there's sand inside the suitcase. And what's so amazing about that is that my parents had honeymooned in Varadero Beach. Varadero Beach is in the province of Matanzas, about half an hour away from the city of Matanzas. And Estevez went and collected sand from Varadero to fill up the suitcase because I had told him my parents had honeymooned in Varadero. And so there's the sand brought back from Cuba inside that suitcase. See another image here. The suitcase is very important. Image, will come back to that. And then that book just a couple of years ago was published as a regular book here in the United States. So you can find it. And I won't go into detail about this poem. If we have time, I can read it to you later. But it's a poem about being a child of many, many exiles, of many, many diasporas, and carrying the key to the house with me always. There was this book, La Cortada, this feeling of not being able to say everything I want to say. This is an expression in Spanish, sentirse cortada. And as you can see, he used these wonderful images of not being able to speak, of feeling cut apart, feeling fragmented. And at the end of the book, there are these puzzle pieces that you put together to create an image of La Cortada. I went on to write this poem, Broken Streets of My City, Las Calles Rotas de mi Ciudad, in English and Spanish, because indeed the streets of Havana are very broken, and I fell on one of these streets once and nearly broke an elbow. And I wanted to address all the things that are broken, including a lot of the tombstones in the Jewish cemetery, but many, many things that are broken and fragmented, and how will we ever be whole again as Cubans and as a Cuban nation. And he took this picture that you saw earlier and hand colored it. That's also in the book. And it's really amazing how he created this book. It's a very, very long poem. He wrote out the poem by hand in his beautiful calligraphy in Spanish and English, and then they made 200 copies of it. You can see here how it's a long poem, and then you open it up and it's like a street. It's a scroll or a street. Really, really amazing. I'll just read these lines to you from it. I come back, an old child. Now they call me señora. I still come back after so many years, an old little girl, una niña vieja. Mommy, papi, please come back. Walk these broken streets of our Havana together with me. Listen to me, your niña vieja. Let me lead you through these broken streets. Dedicated to my parents because they have never wanted to go back to Cuba, and I have gone back so many times. So I want to tell you that just very recently, we have just brought out this book, Handmade in Cuba. And if you're interested in these gorgeous handmade books by Rolando Estevez, this is an entire book about his work. It's a collection of essays and stories about his work. This is the original, where the original came from. And just to give you a quick look, you can see some of the other work that he's done, very, very centered in the city of Matanzas, as you can see here. And they created magazines, La Revista del Vigía, with very different kinds of topics throughout. Like this was one about Afro-Cuban culture, a revista with Jose Marti on the cover. And you see here at the top of his head, the quinqué, that lantern became the symbol of Ediciones Vigía in Matanzas, which was founded as a way of bringing attention to the music and the literature of artists in Matanzas, but then became more and more of a national and international project they created this beautiful book with the screenplay of Strawberry and Chocolate, of Fresa y Chocolate. You can see a beautiful image from this beautiful non-binary image inside. This lovely book, this is a poem by Nancy Morejon about Ana Mendieta, the very important Cuban-American artist who fell to her death in New York. Here's another picture of her. And they were becoming very concerned with poetry all over the world. And they even produced this beautiful book of Emily Dickinson's poetry. And as many of you know, she was very agoraphobic. She stayed in her house as if she needed to quarantine back then. And so it's a beautiful design. And the book is inside this three-dimensional house that Estevez created to house, literally house, Emily Dickinson's poems. And so reaching out to American poetry as well from Cuba. So here's a self-portrait of Estevez. And now what is so interesting is a couple of years ago, he decided he was done with Ediciones Vigía. That was a collective. He was working with various people. Even though he was the co-founder of Ediciones Vigía, he decided to leave that project behind and to create his own new independent bookmaking project called El Fortín, the little fort. And after much, much struggle, he was able to get a very nice space in Matanzas that he has single-handedly, with some help from friends, just restored into an absolutely gorgeous space where he is making handmade books. Vigía books were always in editions of 200 copies. He said he just wants to make as many copies as he wants of a book. Some of them will be one-of-a-kind books. Some of them will be 20 or 30 copies of a particular book. He wants it to be much freer than he felt the Vigía project was. And it's called El Fortín de Estevez. And the symbol, rather than the lantern, is the lighthouse. That is the symbol of this new project. And he is the first person in Cuba to be licensed as an independent bookmaker. And I am so honored that the first book he produced for El Fortín was this book, Dos Mujeres, Una Isla, Two Women, One Island. And you can see it opens up. And the two women he chose are Nancy Morejon, an amazing, very well-known Afro-Cuban poet, and then he chose me. And it was the idea that this Afro-Cuban woman that lives on the island, this Jewish Cuban woman that lives outside the island, that the two of us come together and in a sense become the island. We're two women with one island. And this amazing centerfold in the book where literally we are birthing, the two of us are birthing the island. And so here I am just recently, not too long ago, at El Fortín myself, visiting Estevez in Matanzas. And this is the book that we were presenting then, actually, at the Matanzas Book Fair, Un Cierto Aire Sefardí, a Sephardi Air, which is a story I wrote. You can have another look at it here. And then more recently, I was just in Cuba, literally days before the pandemic and first week of March, and I had written an essay in honor of Caro, who I mentioned before, was the woman who cared for me when I was a child, and he created this lovely book for her. Here you can see a little bit more of it. And one of the things Estevez has done is to restore my second last name to me, because I'm Ruth Behar Glinsky, and in Cuba, as you know, we use two last names. So he has just personally decided to give me both last names. And here, here's a page within the book. So it integrates pictures and the story that I wrote. And then by hand, he writes, Te recordamos, Caro, we remember you. And another one of the newest books of my work that he's made is this one, El Beso, The Kiss, which is the story of my first kiss, which took place in Miami Beach. I was fairly young. We were vacationing there. And I thought I had chosen a very appropriate person by choosing a boy who was Latino, but he was not Jewish. And this became a big issue with my mother. And the story is about that. And anyway, the pictures give you a sense of that story. And I want to end by just showing you this incredible book installation that Estevez made and brought to the University of Michigan, where it's now kept. And it's a suitcase, coming back to the theme of the suitcase. The suitcase, he knows, is very important in my life as someone who travels back and forth all the time, has been going back and forth to Cuba so many times over the last 25, 30 years. And he decided to create this book installation of my work that has the names of all these cities where I live or have lived. He asked for a menorah to put at the very top of the synagogue that we lit when this book was presented formally at an event at the University of Michigan. And he came, of course, and stayed with us in Ann Arbor. It's called La Llave de la Casa, the key to the house. And again, I mentioned how important the key is for those of us who have been exiles over many, many generations. And so inside the suitcase is the book, is the story. He asked me to give him all of these things that I took with me on my travels, makeup, and anything I could give him, clothes, and all of those things are inside the suitcase, as well as the story, the key to the house, and this amazing artwork that you see here. It's all folded up. It's done on paper. It's all folded up. That's a beautiful image of me, I hope. And it's all folded up and inside the suitcase, and you have to open the suitcase. You have to perform the work of opening the book to find this beautiful work of art that is inside this piece. And I wanted to end on this image because this was Estevez at my house, where I'm now speaking to all of you from in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and with the hope that these bridges to and from Cuba will very shortly be possible again. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. It's wonderful. It's amazing how quickly an hour can go by. It's really mesmerizing work and fantastic. We have some questions. I'll start with my question first, which is, how big is the Jewish community in Cuba?
I would say right now, approximately 1,000, but probably a little less. Many have been leaving for Israel in recent years. Again, not because of any sort of anti-Semitic persecution or anything like that, but rather because of economic conditions. So many have left in recent years, I've noticed, for Israel. Many young people have left. But I would say about 900 to 1,000 is still more or less the community of today. And I should emphasize, which I didn't during my talk, that the majority of the community is and I don't want to say interfaith because they're all Jewish, but there are people who've married in to the community and have converted. There are very few people left today who are Jewish both on their mother's and father's side. The majority, curiously, are Jewish on their father's side, and then many have married women who are not of Jewish background, but who have converted. And so once a person converts to Judaism, you're a Jew. That's it. You're not questioned anymore. So I wouldn't want to call them interfaith. They are a mixed. I would say that these are mixed unions, and the community really continues thanks to the efforts of many of the converts who are very, very strongly connected to the community, have learned Hebrew, are very much a part of the Jewish story now, and want to work really hard to maintain the Jewish presence in Cuba.
Yeah, that's cool. We're getting some other questions in. Sharon wants to know, how is the Jewish community affected by the special period?
Yeah, the Jewish community was very affected by the special period in the 90s. That was a time of tremendous shortages. It was after the end of basically the Soviet period in Cuba, after the end of Soviet support for the Cuban economy. And so it was a terrible time, a time of many shortages, loss of electricity, hardly any transportation available. People were riding around on bicycles all over Cuba, really. And it was a very, very hard time for the Jewish community, for sure, as it was for everybody. Tremendous hunger during that time as well. But that was also the period in which American Jews began to travel to Cuba to support the Jewish community, and particularly the groups of American Jews that would go to Cuba and always bring donations, became a very, very important, crucial sources of support for the Jewish Cuban community. And among the things that these groups would bring would be medicines and medical, all kinds of medical supplies that Cuba didn't have. And so the Patronato Synagogue that I've talked about also has a pharmacy that delivers these goods to people in the community, and also to people who are not Jewish, who come with a prescription if they need diabetes medicine or whatever it is. They can get it from the Jewish pharmacy, essentially. So the groups became a very important means of survival to the Jewish community during this special period and up to now. And I should add that in these last few years, they've had a really hard time because many people became afraid to travel to Cuba after Trump became president because of all of the scary news that was, you know, constantly out there, the travel advisories and so on. And so people who would have normally gone to Cuba on these trips, on these Jewish trips to Cuba, were afraid to go. And this has affected the community very, very seriously. For example, I was just there at the very beginning of March, and they were unable to open the synagogues every single day. They were taking turns, like one day one synagogue opens in Havana, another day a different one opens, because they couldn't keep them running. They couldn't keep the air conditioning running in all three temples at once. And so you could really see just the kind of food that they were offering to people after the Shabbat service was a lot more modest than it had been. They couldn't afford to get chicken for everybody as they had been able to when they were getting much more support from the American Jewish and other groups as well that have been supporting the community.
Wow, that's a rough time. Arla wants to know, what do you foresee for Jewish visitors to Cuba? Will they only be allowed to go to specific touristy only areas?
No. Once you're in Cuba, you can go wherever you like. Nobody is telling you where to travel or where not to travel. So, you know, you can travel on your own, and the addresses, for example, of all the synagogues are readily available. And, you know, I've been in Havana many, many times at, you know, at one or another synagogue, especially the Patronato, where I go back to frequently. And I'll be there with Adelador and the president, and people will just wander in and say, "Oh, wow, I found it. I've been looking for the Jewish synagogue." And people will just wander in on their own. And a lot of people will also travel around Cuba and you know, visit the sites, visit the historical architectural sites, which are amazing in Cuba, visit the natural habitats that also can be seen in Cuba, and visit the various synagogues and cemeteries, the Jewish cemeteries in Cuba as well, where you can learn a lot about the history of the community as well. So nobody is controlling you when you're traveling on your own, and when you're traveling with a group, you're with the group, but typically the groups too always include some free time for you to, you know, to wander on your own around Havana. I mean, Havana is endlessly interesting. I mean, you know, I never get bored. Just like drop me off, you know, anywhere in Havana, and especially La Habana Vieja, where my family lived, you know, before the revolution. And it's endlessly fascinating. The streets are endlessly fascinating to see, and you can go anywhere.
Ruth, I think the question had to do with post-pandemic travel, and from
post-pandemic travel.
From my understanding, travel's opening up in Cuba now, but they're really moving they're keeping all the visitors away from Cuban citizens right now for the obvious reasons. So a lot of the travel now is in some of the special tourist zones around the islands around the country. But eventually it'll all come back. And as Ruth said, when you go to Cuba, there's nobody following you. I mean, basically they don't have enough gas to follow you. So they basically, it's a pretty open situation, and you're free to really roam around the country and meet everyone you want to meet. So we're hoping it'll go back to that. I have a question from,
yeah, I'm just going to say, we're hoping it'll go back to that because so many Cubans have restored or you know, just created living spaces for Airbnb travelers, and that became a huge source of income for many, many Cubans, and they very much want American and other tourists to go to Cuba and to be there. They depend on tourism quite a lot, and people have really invested a lot of their own savings and family savings on creating restaurants and boutiques and Airbnbs and so on.
We have one final question from Josh Silver about the Hotel Raquel. When did it become a Jewish hotel? The history that they were given when they visited was that it was set up to cater to Jews from Europe and USA originally. It sounded like a good story, but we don't know what the truth was. That hotel originally a Jewish hotel?
No, it was not originally a Jewish hotel at all. It had nothing to do with Jewish history at all. They just chose it because it was a very beautiful Art Nouveau building, and they thought it would be a very good space for a small boutique hotel. I forget if it's 15 or 20 rooms or 22 rooms. So they wanted to be a small boutique hotel, and it's very near where the Jewish community was located, because the Jewish community was all around that area. It's on Calle Amargura, actually, interestingly enough, Hotel Raquel, but just a block and a half away from La Plaza Vieja. So they wanted a location that was close to Adath Israel, which is the Orthodox synagogue in Havana, so that people could, if they were religious, they could stay there and then walk to the synagogue. So that was the thinking behind it. But no, I think it was like a commercial. It was a commercial space for Spanish merchants, I believe. Before that was what the building had been used for before. So it had nothing to do with the Jewish community, but it was in the neighborhood, and so it seemed like a good choice.
Okay. We also have a comment that we'll read before we close. A few years ago in Miami, a group called Miami New Drama created and premiered a musical called The Golem of Havana, which went on to win awards. I didn't know that, but maybe Ruth, do you know that play?
I do. I know the play very well, and I know the writer and director, Michel Hausman, who I think is wonderful. And I actually got to see the play when it premiered in New York. I went to see it with my son, Gabriel, and I happened to be sitting next to the playwright's father, it so happened. And they are Venezuelan Jewish, and it's a beautiful play about Cuba. I love it. In fact, you're not going to believe this. Just give me a second here. I happen to have a postcard from it. This is how much I remember it warmly. And so yes, I think it's great. And I was just so incredibly thrilled when I learned that this was happening. I'm of course like totally into any artistic work that's a fusion of the Cuban and the Jewish is totally fascinating to me.
Okay, well, thank you, Ruth. It's been really great. It's 6:01, so it's time to close up. Thank you all for being here with us. And we look forward for our invitation to the next speaker, which is coming to you next week. Thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.